black mother and her twin sons die on the same day. But one detail at the funeral shocks everyone. Hey, my sweet family. Welcome back to another unforgettable journey. I'm truly so grateful to have you here. It means the world to me. Before we dive into today's story, I want to speak from the heart for just a moment. Many of you are such loyal supporters, and I can't thank you enough. But I've noticed that some viewers leave the story right at the beginning, and honestly, that really makes it tough for my stories to reach more people. If you ever feel like something's missing or could be better, please tell me. I want your feedback. I'm here to grow with you and give you the best, most powerful stories possible. So, if my stories have ever moved you, made you feel something, or just entertained you, please support me by watching till the end, sharing with your friends, and leaving a comment. It really helps more than you know. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and become part of this beautiful growing family. All right, now that we're all here together, let's begin today's story. The sun rose lazily over the red brick homes of the East Side Historic District in Savannah, casting amber light through lace curtains and dancing across the polished wooden floors of a modest but lovingly kept bungalow where Janelle Davenport's day began, like a warm melody she'd played 1,000 times, routine, reliable, and filled with the kind of maternal grace that seemed to pour effortlessly from her, even when her nights ended in exhaustion and her mornings began before dawn. In the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon toast mingled with freshly brewed coffee as Janelle, wearing a sunflower print robe and her curls pinned high with a leopard print scarf, moved rhythmically between the fridge and the counter, preparing peanut butter sandwiches with swift, practiced hands while humming Stevie Wonder's "Isn't She Lovely?", the lyrics rising above the hum of the refrigerator and the soft thuds of little feet. Her twin boys, Cairo and Khalil, identical in looks but wildly different in spirit, raced through the house, one with a book bag askew and the other with jelly on his cheek, their energy infectious, their giggles sharp and sweet like church bells, filling every room with life and chaos, and the kind of love that made all of Janelle's sacrifices feel like sacred rituals. The walls bore hand-painted family portraits from weekend art projects, and a single framed photo of Malik, their father, smiling under an old oak tree before fate turned him into a memory. And though his absence still whispered in the quietest moments, Janelle had woven strength from grief, building a sanctuary where joy could flourish without asking permission. Outside, crisp golden leaves tumbled across the sidewalk like confetti from a celebration the world forgot to attend, and the neighborhood stirred gently. Mr. Calhoun, next door, sweeping his porch, the mail truck inching its way down the lane, the smell of maple syrup and morning ambition spilling from windows, cracked open just enough to let autumn in. Janelle fastened the boys' coats with soft fingers, adjusted their collars, kissed their foreheads with the reverence of someone who knew the value of every goodbye, and whispered their morning affirmation, "You are brave. You are brilliant. You are Davenport strong," before sending them toward the school bus stop with a proud wave and a mother's silent prayer tucked deep in her chest. She didn't know that behind the routine, behind the laughter, behind the ordinary beauty of that crisp October morning, something ancient and unspeakable had stirred, something watching, waiting, and winding its way toward her world like a slow crack in glass. And in the final moments before the sun reached its peak and time fractured into before and after, Janelle stood on her porch sipping lukewarm coffee, basking in the illusion that today was just another day, completely unaware that her laughter, her warmth, and her heartbeat had already been marked by the kind of fate that arrives without footsteps. The day that began with sunlight and song slowly dimmed into unease as the clock ticked past noon at a St. Mercy hospital, where nurses bustled in scrubs and sneakers over polished tile floors, but one room remained empty. Janelle's, her locker untouched, the time card unstamped, and her phone, usually chirping with check-ins from her boys or reminders about groceries, was eerily silent. Texts from her supervisor went unread, and calls slid to voicemail without even a ring, which was unlike her in every way. Janelle was known for reliability, a woman who showed up no matter how tired, always with that soft smile and the scent of lavender oil following her like a signature. Meanwhile, across town, at West Haven Elementary, the classroom where Cairo and Khalil sat side by side every weekday afternoon felt strangely off balance, their teacher noticing their chairs empty after recess, their untouched worksheets still waiting to be filled with crayon-colored numbers and curious 6-year-old handwriting. They had lined up after lunch like normal, laughing about knock-knock jokes and comparing the battle scars of scraped knees. But when the bell rang to call them back in, they were gone. Vanished without a sound. No calls from the school nurse, no sign of trouble, just absence. The secretary dialed Janelle's emergency number twice, then a third time, then again with a pit growing in her stomach, but got only the distant void of a line that wasn't picking up. By late afternoon, the air in the neighborhood was still and strange, like a silence that had stretched itself too wide. And that was when Marcia Davenport, Janelle's cousin and closest living relative, decided to swing by the house with a mix of irritation and worry bouncing inside her chest, half expecting to find Janelle asleep with a heating pad and a migraine. But instead, she stepped onto the porch and noticed right away. The wind chime wasn't moving, though the trees swayed gently around it, and the door was racked just enough to invite something in or let something out. A children's cartoon hummed from the living room, looping a cheerful theme song over and over. The sound warped slightly, as if it were echoing in a room meant to hold laughter, but now haunted by its own stillness. Marcia hesitated, called out Janelle's name, and stepped inside, her sneakers tapping lightly on the tile, breath catching as she took in the half-empty cereal bowls on the table, one backpack on the floor, crayons spilled across the couch, and the faintest scent of vanilla and shea butter hanging in the air, like a memory trying not to fade. But no footsteps responded, no greeting, not even the scamper of little feet, and with each passing second, the silence grew heavier, denser, like a fog she couldn't see but could feel in her bones. Panic bloomed when she opened the bedroom door and saw no sign of her cousin, only a wrinkled comforter and 3 pillows still holding the faint impressions of heads that had once rested there. The bathroom door creaked open, empty. Closets checked, empty. Back door locked, backyard still. And it was then that a cold wave of dread washed over her, settling in her spine as she backed out of the hallway and called the police, voice trembling, unable to explain the terror curling in her gut. When officers arrived, they moved through the house in practiced patterns, but something about their movements slowed as they stepped into the children's room, decorated with bright murals and superhero decals, and saw the unfinished Lego castle by the window, the toys untouched, the sense that something had interrupted time itself in that space. A search ensued, neighborhood canvassed, phones traced, security footage pulled, but all threads led nowhere. No signs of forced entry, no footprints outside the windows, no struggle, no clue. Just the sense that 3 lives had simply blinked out of the world like a light bulb burning out in a quiet room. Neighbors gathered behind yellow tape, murmuring prayers and shaking their heads, unable to reconcile the cheerful family they'd seen just that morning with the terrifying vacuum now echoing behind that cracked front door. Word spread quickly, whispers turning into wildfire across group chats and porch stoops, the kind of event that pulls a community close while simultaneously pushing them into their own worst fears. Savannah Police held a press conference the next day, standing stiff behind podiums and carefully not using the word vanished, but everyone could hear it between the lines, hanging in the space where answers should have been. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between headlines and hearsay, something darker than confusion took root. An unspoken understanding that this wasn't just a missing persons case, but the beginning of something far more unexplainable. And the moment Marcia stepped back into her car, gripping the wheel with white knuckles and staring at the house that once radiated love, she whispered to herself, with a voice she barely recognized, "They didn't leave. They were taken." The call came just after sunrise, when the air still held that soft grey hush before the city truly awoke, and Marcia, who hadn't slept at all, answered on the first ring, her voice raw, heart pounding in her ears, already bracing for something final. She was instructed to return to Janelle's house, now swarming with investigators, their crisp uniforms and unreadable faces a jarring contrast to the warmth that once lived inside those walls. As she approached the front steps, now shadowed by the morning sun and lined with neatly labeled evidence bags, she saw the door fully ajar, propped open not with caution tape, but with an old rain boot Khalil used to wear when splashing in puddles, and that detail alone nearly broke her in half. The lead detective, a stocky woman with sharp eyes and a tone dulled by too many tragedies, met her at the porch and didn't need to say the words. Marcia already knew. But when they ushered her inside and gently guided her toward the bedroom, nothing could have prepared her for what waited beyond that door. There, in the still quiet sanctity of the room where lullabies were once sung and bedtime stories told, lay Janelle, tucked beneath a navy blue comforter, her face tilted slightly toward the window, as though she were watching the light return to the world. Lips parted just enough to look like she might still be breathing. Her hands rested on her stomach, fingers intertwined in peaceful resignation, and on either side of her, curled into her warmth as if clinging to their last anchor of safety, were Cairo and Khalil, silent, unmoving, their tiny hands wrapped around the fabric of her nightgown in a grasp that made something inside Marcia collapse. There was no blood, no bruises, no shattered furniture or sign of struggle. Only the unnerving calm of a moment, frozen in time, as if death itself had tiptoed in like a careful guest and taken what it came for, with a mercy that felt almost rehearsed. The room was untouched, cell phone still charging beside the lamp, a half-finished book resting on the nightstand, the scent of cocoa butter and faint lavender still lingering in the air like a love note left behind, and the police whispered amongst themselves with furrowed brows, unable to reconcile the peaceful scene with the finality of what it truly meant. Later that day, after the coroner's team gently removed the bodies with silent reverence, Marcia followed them to the morgue, clutching a small stuffed elephant she'd found wedged under Khalil's arm. Her tears dried up from the sheer weight of disbelief, her stomach tight with something darker than grief, something that felt like suspicion. Autopsies were conducted, tests run with sterile efficiency. But every scan, every sample, every chart came back the same. No signs of trauma, no poisons, no allergic reactions, no underlying conditions, just 3 healthy bodies, now inexplicably still. The coroner, a man in his 50s with a face that looked carved from stone, shook his head in a press conference and called it a medical anomaly, explaining to cameras that sometimes the human body does things science can't explain, while trying, and failing, to hide the look of unease beneath his professional mask. But the city didn't need more mystery. It needed closure, and so the narrative quickly became tragedy. An unspeakable loss, a freak occurrence, a mother and her boys gone too soon, their names added to a long, aching list of heartbreaks Savannah had endured over the years. Vigils were held, the candles lit, the teddy bears stacked at the gates of West Haven Elementary, where teachers spoke in hushed tones and parents gripped their children tighter at pickup, all while reporters tried to package the story into digestible sorrow for the evening news. But Marcia couldn't accept what they were selling, not because she didn't want to, but because something in her soul screamed that this wasn't just death, it was disruption, like the rules of life, and time had been bent in that room. And she kept remembering how Khalil used to draw the same shadowy figure over and over, and how Janelle once said, half laughing, that the twins had imaginary friends who showed up only after midnight. Those memories, once harmless, now echoed with menace, and as she stood in the now empty house, tracing her fingers over the indentations in the bedsheets, she felt it in her bones. This wasn't over. This was the beginning of something far stranger than the world was ready to believe. The house was too quiet now, hollow in a way that creaked beneath its own silence, and when Marcia stepped through the door holding a duffel bag and funeral brochures, the very air seemed changed, stiller, heavier, like it had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. She'd never lived alone before. Not really, and certainly not in a home that still smelled like the people it used to hold. A whiff of coconut shampoo in the hallway, the faint trace of popcorn in the microwave, the elusive scent of Janelle's favorite incense hiding somewhere in the vents. Every corner was cluttered with echoes, half-folded laundry on the couch, mail still unopened, a backpack resting like a forgotten memory on the stairs. And though she tried to steel herself with logic, Marcia felt like a trespasser walking through the heart of something sacred. Her first night in Janelle's home was filled with the kind of work that feels like penance, sorting clothes by size and season, labeling boxes, carefully stacking artwork drawn in bold, bright colors by tiny hands that would never color again. Exhaustion finally claimed her somewhere around midnight, and she collapsed onto the pull-out couch in the den, wrapped in one of Janelle's old quilts, too tired to cry, too numb to pray. That's when she heard it. Soft and subtle at first, like a memory bleeding through the walls, a faint hum, barely audible, rising and falling in the gentle cadence of Janelle's favorite lullaby, the one she used to sing while braiding the twins' hair, a melody that should have died with them, but now floated down the hallway like smoke. Marcia sat up sharply, heart racing, eyes wide in the dark as she strained to hear again. But the house offered nothing except the usual night groans of wood settling and pipes breathing. But she knew what she'd heard. The next night, it was laughter. Cairo's unmistakable giggle, high and sharp, the kind that used to echo off the living room walls during pillow fights or episodes of their favorite cartoons, and though it lasted only a second, it burrowed deep into Marcia's chest, rekindling a fear she couldn't name. Still, she convinced herself it was grief, that her mind was short-circuiting under the weight of sorrow, conjuring sounds from memories that refused to settle. But the dreams said otherwise, vivid, cinematic things that pulled her into long hallways with no end, where Janelle stood at the far side, humming, never turning around, and the twins darted past her in flickers of colour, always just out of reach. Sometimes Marcia would wake up mid-scream, soaked in sweat, with the undeniable feeling that someone had been standing at the foot of the bed. On the third night, while organizing the linen closet, she noticed something odd about the coat closet across the hall. Its door slightly ajar, though she remembered closing it earlier. She crossed the hall slowly, nerves tight, and opened it to find what she expected. Jackets, umbrellas, boots, but something else too. Something taped low to the inside of the door where a child might reach. It was a crayon drawing, jagged and uneven, the paper curled at the edges and marked with heavy strokes in dark blue and black. Two small children, unmistakably the twins, holding hands with a towering figure drawn in hollow grey, faceless, long arms bending unnaturally, as if stretching toward them like vines. The figure loomed over them, yet the children smiled in that unnervingly cheerful way only kids could when they don't yet understand danger. What stopped Marcia cold wasn't just the image, but the words scrawled across the bottom in shaky, childish handwriting. He came back. The letters uneven and pressed hard enough to nearly tear the paper, a desperate message or warning, she couldn't tell which. Her breath caught, and for a long time she just stood there, staring at the drawing, feeling her pulse drum in her ears, her skin prickling with cold recognition as a memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years, of a story Janelle once told at a family gathering, laughing nervously about how Cairo had started waking up at night, crying about the tall man with no face in the closet, and how she'd chalked it up to too many bedtime stories. Suddenly, it didn't feel like a story anymore. The hallway behind her seemed longer than before, the shadows denser, and the once comforting walls now whispered with unfamiliar tension, like they were holding secrets they wanted her to hear, but only when she was alone and the lights were low. With shaking hands, Marcia took the drawing down, placed it on the coffee table, and stared at it under the dim lamplight. And for the first time since the funeral arrangements began, she realized this wasn't just grief. It was a warning, and Janelle's home wasn't empty. It was watching, waiting, whispering truths that nobody wanted to believe. The quiet of Janelle's home had begun to gnaw at Marcia like a hunger she couldn't satisfy. And as days bled into nights, a part of her became convinced that she wasn't just cleaning out her cousin's life. She was walking through a labyrinth of secrets that Janelle had left behind on purpose, as if the walls themselves were whispering things that had been buried for too long. It was on the fourth afternoon, while sorting through boxes of forgotten baby clothes and high school yearbooks in the attic, that Marcia's hand brushed against something unfamiliar, something small, heavy, and cool to the touch. She pulled it out, dusting off a chest that looked older than the house itself. A weathered wooden box with a rusted lock and a delicate carving of a crescent moon on its side, as if someone had once thought the box itself was a secret waiting to be protected. Curiosity flickered within her, though she knew she shouldn't. Her fingers trembled as she found the small key hidden in the lining of an old sweater, wedged deep inside a pocket as though it had been placed there with deliberate care. With the soft click of the lock, the chest opened, and inside, nestled among yellowing photo albums and crumpled napkins from family picnics, lay a leather-bound journal, its pages curled at the edges, its cover cracked with age. Janelle's handwriting, so familiar, so deeply personal, was scrawled across the first page in slanted, hurried letters. "The things I see at night. I'm not sure they're real anymore." Marcia sat back, clutching the journal like an artifact from another world, the weight of it heavy in her lap as she turned the pages, each entry revealing a thread of Janelle's unraveling reality. Recurring dreams, descriptions of a shadowy figure that always appeared at 2:14 a.m., standing just outside her bedroom window, staring into the house with dark, unblinking eyes. At first, Janelle thought it was the stress of being a single mother, the exhaustion of her work at the hospital, the weight of raising two energetic boys on her own in a world that never paused for her. But as the weeks stretched on, the figure grew bolder, moving closer to the window, tapping lightly on the glass in a way that made the hairs on the back of Janelle's neck stand up. And then the twins began waking up in the middle of the night, their cries sharp and panicked, rushing into her room with wide, terrified eyes, speaking words that chilled her to the bone. "He's back, Mama. He's standing in the corner." At first, Janelle dismissed it, thinking it was just the product of an overactive imagination, but the frequency of their night terrors, the wild look in their eyes when they spoke of the shadow, soon convinced her otherwise. She started checking the windows, looking into the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the quiet expanse of the savannah night, the rustling of trees, and the occasional distant sound of a car passing by. But the dreams, they became something more, taking root in her sleep like a poison that seeped into her waking life, and Janelle wrote again and again of the suffocating presence that seemed to be drawing closer, the sensation of being watched, the ever-growing fear that something was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Marcia's heart pounded as she read the entries, one after another, feeling the tension building with each page, her hands trembling as she turned to the final entry, dated just 2 days before their deaths. Janelle had written, her handwriting more frantic, more urgent than before. "I don't know how much longer we can hide from him. If anything happens to me, don't trust the silence." The words hit Marcia like a blow to the chest, as if the air in the room had suddenly turned to lead. The finality of it, the desperation in Janelle's words, made her blood run cold. And for the first time since the tragedy, Marcia felt as though she was staring into the heart of something unexplainable, something far darker than she could have imagined. She slammed the journal shut, her thoughts spiraling, her mind racing back to the drawing in the closet, the tall, faceless figure holding hands with the twins. The connection was undeniable now. The figure Janelle had described in her dreams, the one that haunted her every night, was the same entity the twins had spoken about. The same one that had marked them in ways no one fully understood. The silence wasn't just a void. It was a warning, a trap, a signal that something had been waiting patiently for this moment. Marcia's mind screamed with questions, with the gnawing suspicion that what had happened to Janelle and the twins wasn't an accident, wasn't a tragedy. It was a curse, a fate they'd been trying to outrun for months. But now it was too late, and with the journal in her hands, she knew one thing for certain. The truth was buried deep within these pages, and the secrets they contained were the key to understanding the darkness that had claimed her family. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting for her next move. The day of the funeral felt like a storm was coming, the air thick with grief and tension that seemed to hang over Savannah like a cloud that refused to dissipate. Greater hope. Baptist Church was filled with mourners, friends, family, neighbors, all gathered in the pews, their faces wet with sorrow as they struggled to process the incomprehensible loss of Janelle, Cairo, and Khalil. The church was packed to the rafters, the sweet scent of lilies and roses mingling with the heavier perfume of tears and despair, as soft whispers passed between those who had known them best. Janelle, the hard-working, nurturing mother who always made sure her boys had everything they needed. Cairo, the playful twin with the infectious smile. And Khalil, the quiet one with a heart full of love and an uncanny ability to make everyone feel seen. The pastor, Reverend Edmonds, stood at the pulpit, his deep voice breaking through the silence, offering words of comfort and hope, reminding the congregation of God's grace even in the most tragic of times. But as he spoke, there was a heavy weight in the room, as if the very walls themselves knew that something wasn't right. Marcia stood near the front, her hands folded tightly, her heart raw from the past few days of unraveling Janelle's secrets. Yet she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something unspoken, was still lingering, hidden just beneath the surface. Her eyes flitted toward the caskets lined up at the front of the church, one large to hold Janelle, and two smaller ones for the twins, side by side in perfect symmetry, their tiny names etched delicately into the polished wood. The lids closed forever on lives that had barely begun. The tears came without warning, flowing freely down her cheeks as she thought of those sweet faces, the ones she'd never see again, and her breath hitched in her chest as she tried to maintain composure. It was then, just as the final hymn began, and the congregation rose to sing, that the unthinkable happened. Khalil's casket, the smallest of the three, the one that had been laid closest to his mother, began to shake. At first, it was subtle, just a tremor that might have been attributed to the vibrations of the organ, but then it grew more distinct, rattling violently, as if something inside the casket were trying to break free. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a stunned silence that hung thick in the air, and every eye turned toward the casket. Their collective breath held in disbelief, unsure if they were witnessing a nightmare or some grotesque trick of the light. Marcia's heart pounded in her ears, her pulse quickening as the rattling continued, each violent shake causing the casket to shift slightly on its pedestal. Her first instinct was to look at the funeral directors, standing nervously to the side. But they were just as stunned as everyone else, frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The murmurs of confusion grew louder, and Pastor Edmunds stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. Yet his voice remained steady as he tried to maintain control, calling for calm, telling the congregation that this was nothing more than a coincidence, a disturbance, a trick of the air. But even as he spoke, his words began to falter, and the rattling grew louder, more frantic, as though something was struggling to escape the confines of the casket, desperate to get out. Marcia's knees went weak, her mind reeling as she looked at Khalil's casket, and the image of the drawing she had found in the closet flashed in her mind. He came back. A horrifying realization crept up on her. This wasn't just some freak accident, some natural occurrence. This was something else. The weight of the moment hit her like a tidal wave, and all she could think was that Khalil, even in death, was still reaching out, still fighting to escape the force that had taken him. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension so thick it was suffocating, and just as the rattling reached its peak, something strange happened. The casket stopped shaking. The air seemed to change, as if an unseen force had released its grip, and the room, which had been suspended in time, slowly exhaled. The murmurs died down, and people began looking at each other, unsure of what to make of what they had just witnessed. And in that moment, as the casket finally settled, the whisper of wind against the church windows felt colder than it should have, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Marcia, still in a daze, stepped back, her hand clutching her chest, her thoughts tangled in a knot of fear and confusion. She glanced down at the ground, and for the briefest of moments she could have sworn she heard a voice, Khalil's voice, soft and distant, calling out her name, a plea that no one else seemed to hear. The service ended shortly after, the rest of the ceremony carried out in a haze of disbelief. But Marcia knew something had changed in that moment, something far beyond the reach of any explanation. As they lowered the caskets into the earth, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had stirred Khalil's casket was still watching, still waiting. And worse, it was only just beginning. The world seemed to stop in that brief moment, as if the very air around them had thickened, holding its breath in shock. When the funeral director, his face pale and trembling, flung open the lid of Khalil's casket, what met their eyes was a chilling emptiness, a gaping void where a small boy should have been, where the body of Khalil should have lain, dressed in his favorite blue shirt, a tiny replica of the clothes he wore to his first school play. But instead, there was nothing, not even the faintest trace of him. The fabric that had once cushioned his lifeless form was gone. The smooth satin lining, the little silk pillow. It was all empty, as if something had swallowed it whole, as if Khalil himself had never existed in that casket at all. The congregation screamed in unison, a collective sound of disbelief and terror that shattered the fragile composure the service had left behind. Some people rushed to the front, others stumbled backward, tripping over pews in their panic, while the funeral director stood frozen, hands trembling as he stared down into the void, his mind unable to process the reality unfolding before him. Marcia, her heart hammering in her chest, felt the ground beneath her feet shift like it was made of sand. She couldn't breathe, couldn't understand as she stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper as she demanded, "Where's Khalil? Where's my nephew?" But there was no answer, only the deafening silence of the empty casket. Someone from the back shouted for the police, and within moments the church was swarmed with officers, their faces set with grim determination. But even they could only stare at the scene, trying to make sense of the impossible. "Secure the area," one of them barked, and the others scrambled into action, cordoning off the area with yellow tape, ushering the family and guests into a separate room, away from the terrifying sight that had just unfolded. Marcia, shaking uncontrollably, was escorted out with the others, her mind racing, her hands gripping her cousin's old quilt to hall. Comfort, as though somehow this would shield her from what she'd just witnessed. She thought of the journal, of the strange whispers and the dreams, the drawing in the closet and the rattling casket. This was no accident, she thought. Something far darker was at play, something that had been following them all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. The police were calm, professional even, but beneath their composed exteriors, Marcia could see the same confusion, the same sense of unease in their eyes. They were out of their depth. How could a body disappear? How could a child, confirmed dead by medical professionals, simply vanish from his own casket, leaving no trace behind? The authorities had conducted an autopsy on Khalil before the funeral, confirming his death, listing the cause as unknown. And yet now, it was as if he had never existed in the first place. The casket had been sealed in front of witnesses, locked for transport to the burial site, and yet when it opened, it was completely empty, as though Khalil had been erased from existence entirely. The investigations began immediately, but the more the police dug, the more questions they had, and fewer answers they could provide. The coroner, who had signed off on the official cause of death, was baffled, unable to explain how Khalil's body could have vanished without a trace. Witnesses who had seen the casket on the way to the graveyard couldn't offer any clues, and even the funeral home's security footage, supposedly foolproof, showed nothing unusual. The box had been sealed, locked, and delivered without incident. And yet now, it sat in front of them, empty, as if something had taken Khalil's body and replaced it with an illusion. A trick, Marcia thought bitterly, but a trick too perfect to understand. As night fell, the neighborhood was rocked with rumors, whispers filling the streets like the sound of leaves rustling in a gale. Some claimed that they had seen something moving in the shadows, that they'd heard footsteps outside their windows late at night, footsteps too heavy for any person to make, and that strange, flickering lights had been seen at the edge of town. The police cordoned off Janelle's home once again, but even they couldn't stop the tide of fear that spread through the streets like wildfire. Marcia, sitting in her cousin's house, her mind racing with thoughts of the journal and the cryptic words it contained, couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far worse than anyone realized, something ancient and vengeful, something that had been waiting for years. And now, it had come to claim what was owed. As the investigation dragged on, the family was whisked away into protective custody, hidden from the public eye, while the police tried to piece together what had happened. But Marcia, despite the mounting pressure and growing uncertainty, couldn't let go of the nagging feeling that they were being watched, that the empty casket was just the beginning, that Khalil had not truly left them. He had been taken, and it was only a matter of time before the truth, and the darkness it held, would come to claim them all. The steady patter of rain against the window pane was a sound that Marcia had learned to dread, for it seemed to carry with it an eerie weight that pressed heavily on her chest. She stood in her kitchen, staring out into the darkened street, her thoughts still spiraling around the disappearance of Khalil's body, the inexplicable events of the funeral, and the gnawing fear that something was watching her, something she couldn't see but felt with every fiber of her being. The night outside was thick with rain, the world blurred behind the curtain of water, and the streetlights cast long, wavering shadows across the wet pavement, turning the familiar into something unrecognizable, distorted. She could barely make out the figures of houses across the street, the tall oak trees swaying gently in the wind. It was then that her eyes locked onto a small figure standing at the edge of the sidewalk, motionless, drenched to the bone by the downpour. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she thought she was seeing things. The rain, the darkness, it was all playing tricks on her. But no, there was a child standing alone in the storm, barefoot, soaked through, and holding a Spider-Man backpack, the same backpack that Khalil had taken to school just days before, the same one he'd worn with pride as he skipped down the sidewalk that morning, so full of life, so full of promise. Khalil! The name surged through her mind like a tide, a rush of desperate hope and terror. She didn't even hesitate. She flung open the door and ran out into the rain, her heart pounding, her voice screaming his name into the night air. Khalil! Khalil, baby! Where are you? The sound of her voice, trembling and desperate, was swallowed by the rain. But she didn't care. She had to get to him. She had to make sure he was safe, that this nightmare was just that, a nightmare. But as she raced down the wet sidewalk, her feet slipping on the slick pavement, something inside her told her that this wasn't just a dream. It was real. The child stood there, motionless, unmoving, as if waiting for her. But when she reached the spot where he should have been, where she had seen him just seconds before, he was gone, vanished into the rain, into the night. Marcia stood frozen in the middle of the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands trembling as she searched the shadows, the darkness, the wet expanse of street that stretched before her. There was no sign of Khalil, no footprints, no trace of him anywhere. Where did he go? Her eyes scanned the empty street, a sense of dread curling deep in her stomach. She was about to turn back when something caught her eye. There, lying in the puddle at the edge of the sidewalk, the very same Spider-Man backpack that the child had been holding. Her heart stopped. The backpack, now soaked through, was unmistakable, its bright colors muted in the rain, the zipper slightly open, as if someone had dropped it in haste, as if they had been in a hurry to leave. No child, no person, no ghost could have left it behind unless they had been taken. Marcia's hands shook violently as she knelt down, picking up the backpack. It was heavy with water, weighed down by the downpour, but as she held it in her hands, a wave of cold dread washed over her, the air around her feeling suddenly too thick to breathe. This wasn't just some forgotten belonging. It was a symbol, a sign that Khalil hadn't gone far. She looked around one last time, hoping for some explanation, some clarity. But there was nothing. No sign of Khalil, no sign of anything that made sense. The rain fell harder now, drenching her completely as she stood alone on the dark street, clutching the backpack to her chest as if it could somehow protect her from the terrifying reality that had unfolded. Her mind raced, flashing back to the strange occurrences that had plagued her in the days leading up to this moment. The rattling casket, the whispers in the house, the drawing of the faceless man holding the twins' hands. It was all coming together in a way she didn't want to accept, in a way that felt far too final. She knew now, deep in her gut, that Khalil hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken, snatched from this world by something dark and powerful, something that had come for him long before his death. Marcia stumbled backward, her legs shaking with the weight of the truth that was sinking in. She felt the cold water seeping into her clothes, her skin numbing against the chill, but none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except for the empty space where Khalil had once been, the unanswered questions, and the terror that now gripped her heart. The world around her seemed to close in as she stood there, the rain pouring relentlessly, as if washing away all the hope she had left. She held the backpack tightly, a small, fragile connection to the child she had lost. And in the silence that followed, the air felt heavy with the weight of something ancient, something that had waited for this moment to strike. And as the last vestiges of light faded into the night, Marcia realized with a shudder that they weren't just dealing with a ghost. They were dealing with a force far older and darker than they could have ever imagined. Marcia's search for answers took her down a path that was darker and more twisted than she could have imagined, and it began with a quiet visit to an old neighbor's house on the outskirts of Savannah, a place that seemed frozen in time. Ezekiel was an elderly man, stooped with age and frail, but his mind remained sharp, like the edge of a well-worn knife. He had lived in the same house for decades, a crumbling, weathered building on a street long since abandoned by the bustle of the city. The paint on his porch was peeling, and the windows were covered in grime. But there was a certain stillness about the place, an unsettling calm that made Marcia's skin crawl as she knocked softly on his door. When he answered, his eyes were bleary, his hair a patchwork of grey, but there was a glint in them, something knowing, something that suggested he had seen far more than anyone should. "I knew you'd come," he said cryptically, stepping aside to let her in. His voice was raspy, thick with years of secrets, and as they sat down at his small kitchen table, Marcia felt a chill creep up her spine, her fingers instinctively tightening around the crumpled piece of paper in her hand, the one she had found in Janelle's journal, the final entry that spoke of hiding from someone or something, and warning against trusting the silence. Marcia wasted no time. "Ezekiel, I need you to tell me everything you know about the Watcher," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The old man's gaze darkened, and for a moment he seemed to consider whether or not to speak. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The Watcher, huh? You mean the gentleman?" The name sent a shiver through her. She had heard it whispered in the streets, half-believed legends shared by those too afraid to speak openly. But never like this. Never with the weight of truth hanging in the air. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed as he began his story, his words slow but steady. "He's been around for generations, you know. Comes when grief is heavy, when the pain of loss is too much to bear. People think he's a spirit, or a demon, or maybe something in between. But he's not like that, not exactly. He's a being that offers peace, an end to the suffering. He comes to those on the edge of despair, people who've lost someone they love, who can't see a way out of the hurt. And he offers them a deal. Marcia's heart pounded in her chest. "A deal," she echoed. Ezekiel nodded, his old hands trembling slightly. "Yes, a deal. The kind that promises a return of what was lost. You get someone back, someone you love. But there's a price, always a price." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "Janelle, she made that deal, you know, after Malik died in the crash." Marcia's breath caught in her throat. Malik, Janelle's late husband, who had died 6 years ago in a tragic car accident. She had never truly understood the depth of Janelle's grief over him, never realized how it had haunted her, how it had shaped the choices she made in the aftermath. But she didn't tell anyone. She didn't tell me, Marcia whispered, her mind spinning. Ezekiel's face hardened with sorrow. No, she wouldn't. No one ever does. You see, once you make the deal with the gentleman, you don't speak of it. Not to anyone. Not ever. It's part of the bargain. You get your loved one back, but it's never the same. They're not the same. And in return, your soul becomes his. Slowly, over time. Marcia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room. The gentleman, a being who came not only to offer the return of the dead, but also to claim a part of you in the process. She thought of Janelle's restless nights, the strange occurrences leading up to her death, and then of Khalil, the disappearance of his body, his empty casket. "So, you think Janelle, she made a deal to bring Malik back?" Marcia asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if saying the words aloud might make it all real. Ezekiel nodded slowly, his face twisted in sorrow. "I do, and in doing so, she traded her own soul, and when she couldn't keep her end of the bargain anymore, when the cost became too much to bear, that's when the Watcher came for her. When he took her, and her boys with her. But he didn't take them in the way you'd think. He doesn't kill. He doesn't need to. He takes what's his, what's owed to him. In the end, your soul is his. That's the price of what you bargain for." Marcia's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. Janelle's early, unexplained depression, her sense of being watched, the strange, unexplainable events leading up to her death, the journal, the cryptic warnings, the gentleman, the Watcher. Janelle had made a choice, an irreversible choice that had cost her everything. And now, Khalil, he had been taken too. Marcia felt the full weight of the horror press in on her, the weight of something ancient, something that existed far beyond human comprehension, lurking in the shadows of their lives, watching, waiting for the right moment to claim what was his. "What can I do, Ezekiel?" Marcia asked, her voice breaking, a tear slipping down her cheek. "How do I stop this?" Ezekiel's eyes softened, but his words were grim. "There's nothing you can do, child. Once you make the deal, it's too late. The gentleman will come when it's time, and he'll take what's his. You can't fight him. You can only pray that he's merciful." Marcia's heart shattered as the old man's words sank into her soul. The truth was undeniable now. The gentleman had claimed Janelle, had claimed her family, and there was no way to turn back. The only thing left was to face the consequences of the deal made long ago, and to hope that she could protect what was left of her family before the Watcher came for them too. The cemetery was a quiet at night, the kind of stillness that made the shadows seem deeper, the air colder. The only sound was the rustling of leaves, carried by a soft, restless breeze that swept through the rows of graves. It was a place where memories lay buried, where sorrow lingered like a heavy fog. But in the stillness of that night, something else stirred. Something dark, something that had no place among the living. Marcia stood outside the small chapel near the cemetery, her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the footage on the screen. The security video, pulled from the cameras that had been discreetly installed just days before the funeral, had been meticulously analyzed, reviewed frame by frame. It was meant to capture any potential vandalism, anything suspicious in the wake of Khalil's strange disappearance. But what they found was far worse than anything they could have anticipated. The footage was clear, too clear. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the time that had become a haunting number in Marcia's mind ever since she'd read Janelle's journal, the camera captured a figure moving toward Khalil's grave. It was a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to emerge from the darkness like a shadow given form. It was almost featureless, its shape vaguely humanoid, but distorted, unnervingly so, as if the very act of existing in the physical realm was an effort for it. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, a fluidity that seemed to defy the usual constraints of human movement. As it reached Khalil's casket, the ground seemed to tremble beneath its feet, and the camera flickered. A glitch, just as the figure approached. The next moment, the camera went black, the footage corrupted, as if the very presence of the figure had somehow disrupted the technology itself. Marcia's heart raced as she watched the video repeat in a loop, the same terrifying sequence playing over and over. It wasn't just a glitch, it was something more, something that couldn't be explained, something that couldn't be rationalized. She knew what it meant. The figure was real. It had come for Khalil. And it wasn't finished. As the footage ended, Marcia turned to face the others in the room, her family, the small group of close friends who had been gathered to witness the disturbing truth. Her hands trembled as she held the remote control, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. It was too much to process, too much to bear. What do we do now?" Marcia's voice cracked as she spoke, the words feeling hollow in the air. She felt the weight of the unknown bearing down on her, and for the first time, she wondered if there was any escape from what was happening. The room fell silent, the tension unbearable as everyone struggled to come to terms with the footage they had just seen. Finally, Pastor Edmonds, the gentle and solemn man who had delivered the funeral sermon just days ago, stood up. His face was drawn, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as if he too was wrestling with the gravity of what was unfolding. "It's him," he said, his voice low and steady, but filled with an eerie certainty. "It's the gentleman." Marcia turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief. "You know who this is," she demanded, her heart pounding as she gripped the edge of the table for support. Pastor Edmonds nodded solemnly. "I've seen him before, long ago. A case much like this one." His words hung heavy in the air, and Marcia could feel the collective breath of the room hold in suspense. "What do you mean?" she pressed. "Who is he? What is he?" Pastor Edmonds seemed to hesitate, as if trying to find the right words. He walked over to the window, staring out at the darkened cemetery in the distance, the rain falling gently across the gravestones, the wind whispering through the trees. "When I was a younger man, I was called to another family's home, much like yours, a family torn apart by grief, a father who had lost his child to illness. The mother, She made a deal, just like Janelle. She brought her son back, but there was a price. The gentleman came for him, and when the child returned, it wasn't the same. He was hollow, like a shell. But the mother, she didn't care. She thought she had won. Until one night, she found her son standing by her bedside, his eyes empty, staring at her, and he spoke words that weren't his. Pastor Edmonds shuddered at the memory. That's when I understood. The gentleman doesn't give without taking. He doesn't just take lives, he takes souls. And when he comes, there's no stopping him. He collects what's his. No matter how much time passes, he always returns. Marsha's blood ran cold. She thought of Khalil, the way he had disappeared, the way his casket had rattled at the funeral. It was all coming together now, all of it. The terror that had gripped her heart, the sense of something watching, something waiting. It was all connected. The gentleman had come back, and he wasn't done. "What do we do now?" Marsha whispered, her voice barely audible as the weight of the revelation crushed her chest. Pastor Edmonds turned to her, his face pale. "We can't fight him," he said quietly. "All we can do is prepare. He'll come for the others soon. And when he does, there will be nothing left to stop him." The room was silent for a long moment as the full extent of what was happening sank in. The gentleman had returned, and this time there was no one left to make a deal, no one left to bargain with him. He would claim what was his, and there was no way to stop it. The figures in the security footage had vanished into the night, but the terror they left behind lingered like a shadow that would never fade. Marsha was left with only one thought: how long until he came for her? The house felt like it was holding its breath. Marsha had returned with nothing but her faith, a battered rosary, and a hollow courage forged in grief. She moved through the rooms like a ghost herself, each step echoing through memories too painful to recall. Janelle's scent still clung faintly to the curtains. The twins' handprints were still smudged on the hallway walls. It was a house that had known love, laughter, and now, loss. She stepped into Janelle's bedroom, the same place where the nightmare had revealed itself, and sat on the edge of the bed. The clock read 2:04 a.m. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the rosary, thumb running over the tarnished cross again and again. She wasn't a particularly religious woman, but tonight she prayed with a desperation beyond belief. Her knees ached from the tension, her breath came in tight little gasps, and still she did not move. She couldn't. This was her stand. She wouldn't let the darkness take anyone else. Outside, the wind howled, and then all went silent. The digital clock blinked. 2:14 a.m. The room chilled instantly. The temperature dropped like a trap door under her feet. Her breath fogged the air in front of her. The walls seemed to lean in. Shadows thickened. And then he stepped from the darkness like he had always been there, simply waiting for his hour. The gentle man, dressed immaculately in a black suit, tall as the doorframe, with impossibly long limbs and a stillness that felt more violent than motion. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow across what should have been a face, but wasn't. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone, like a blank canvas meant for fear. But it was the presence behind him that ripped the breath from Marsha's lungs. Khalil. The little boy she had cradled, kissed, and grieved. He stood just behind the gentleman, barefoot, eyes wide and glassy, soaked from unseen rain, a smudge of dirt across his cheek. He looked up at her like a child lost in the woods. Not dead, not alive. Trapped somewhere in between. Marcia stood, her voice rising like a raw flame. "You can't have him!" Her shout cracked the cold air, the kind of scream that came from the marrow. The gentleman didn't flinch. He merely tilted his head slowly to the side, like a spider regarding a fly caught in its web. Then, for the first time, he spoke, his voice dry, ancient, layered in echoes. "Then offer something else." The words weren't loud, but they filled the room, rattled the windows, pierced her ears. It was a voice made of dust and forgotten tombs. Marcia's knees buckled under the weight of the words, but she didn't collapse. "He's just a boy," she whispered. "You took Janelle. You took her peace. Why him?" The gentleman remained still. Khalil looked at her, lips trembling. "Auntie, I'm scared." That was enough. That was everything. Marcia stepped between the boy and the shadow, her heart racing so hard she thought it might break her ribs. She gripped the rosary like a weapon. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Me?" Silence. The gentleman extended a long, gloved hand, palm up. A memory, a voice, a warmth. The price must be paid. Marcia's mind reeled. A memory, a voice? She didn't understand. Until suddenly she did. This wasn't about blood. It was about essence, the things that made them whole. "If I give it, he goes free?" she asked, voice cracking. The gentleman nodded once. Slowly. Khalil looked at her, confused. "What's he mean, Auntie?" Marcia bent to his level, holding his face in her hands. Her tears blurred his features. "It means I might not remember your laugh anymore, baby, or your mama's face. It means I might never feel joy the same way again. But you'll live. That's all that matters." He clutched her arm. "Don't do it." She kissed his forehead. "This is what love does." Then, without another word, she turned and placed her palm in the gentleman's outstretched hand. It felt like plunging into a river of ice and fire. The room screamed, literally screamed, as the shadows twisted and flared around them. Light exploded behind her eyes. Her breath was ripped from her lungs. And then, quiet. Marcia collapsed to the floor, the rosary clattering beside her. She blinked up at the ceiling, breathing hard. Her hands shook. Her chest hurt. And then she realized she couldn't remember. Not what her sister's laugh sounded like. Not how Khalil's eyes crinkled when he smiled. It was all gone. Her memories, the good ones, had been taken. Khalil stood above her, sobbing. "Auntie, what's wrong? You did it. I'm okay." She looked at him and felt nothing. No recognition, just the echo of sacrifice. She smiled through the tears, forcing warmth into a hollow space. "I'm glad you're safe." The gentleman was gone. So was part of her. But Khalil had been spared. The price had been paid. In the final, flickering moments before the clock would strike 2:15 a.m., the air in Janelle's bedroom felt like a womb, suspended in time, thick with fate. Marcia stood tall, exhausted in soul, but unbroken in spirit, her fingers gently releasing the last grip on the rosary that had guided her through fear, grief, and unimaginable darkness. Khalil had run into her arms with a soundless cry, his small frame trembling, face buried in her chest, as though he knew, somewhere deep inside, that this embrace would be the last. "Go, baby," she whispered, holding him tight, memorizing the feel of him, even as her memories began to dissolve like smoke. "Live your life. Don't look back." Her voice quivered, soft and resolute, etched with both farewell and unconditional love. Behind her, the gentleman stood silent, An obsidian statue carved from forgotten sorrow and ancient promises, his featureless face tilted in solemn approval. He did not speak again. He did not need to. The choice had been accepted, and the balance restored. In the stillness, a wind rose from nowhere, swirling around them. Not violent, but sacred. Marcia's hair lifted in the air, and her eyes closed. Her body began to shimmer. Not with light, but with absence. Her form flickered, edges fraying like a photo burned at the corners. Khalil clutched her tighter, but his hands passed through her. And just like that, she was gone. No scream, no flash, no trace. Just the faint scent of lavender in the cold, empty air. When the sun rose over Savannah the next morning, the world went on as if nothing had happened, except for one impossible thing. On the stone steps of Greater Hope Baptist Church, just beneath the Iron Cross, a janitor named Carlton found a little boy curled up asleep. His Spider-Man backpack was soaked with dew, but his skin was warm, his breath steady. It was Khalil Davenport, pronounced dead only days before. The boy opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the light. He said nothing, not a word. But the moment he saw the steeple rising above him, he smiled. The doctors at St. Mercy were baffled. His vitals were perfect, no signs of trauma. No medical explanation for how he had returned. The death certificate, already filed and signed, was quietly shredded. The police tried to reopen the investigation, but there was no evidence left to trace. Nothing about that night could be explained with logic, but the people of Savannah didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They called it what it was, a miracle. Pastor Edmonds spoke of divine intervention. Neighbors whispered of angels. Children told each other tales of ghosts and guardians. But Khalil said nothing. Not about the gentleman. Not about the night of whispers and cold wind. Not about Marcia. He returned to school, quiet and observant, eyes older than his years. And though he played like any other boy, smiled like any other child, there was a shadow in him that never quite lifted, a silence he carried like armor. Time passed. He grew tall like his father, kind like his mother, brave like Marcia. But he never forgot. Every year, on October 17th, the day the world changed, he disappeared for a few hours without telling anyone where he was going. No one asked. They knew. He would walk alone to the old river bend, where the moss hung thick and the air smelled like memory. In his hand he carried 3 roses, one crimson for Janelle, the mother who sang through struggle and fought through fear, one white for Cairo, the brother who never got to grow up, who still visited him in dreams, and one yellow for Marcia, the woman who chose love over life, who gave herself so he could have a future. He'd stand by the water, eyes closed, letting the wind move around him, waiting for a whisper he never heard again. Then, gently, he'd place each rose in the current and watch them drift downriver, floating like small silent prayers. And every time, as the last bloom disappeared around the bend, he'd whisper 4 words to the wind. I remember you all. No one saw the gentleman again. Not in that town. Not in that house. The shadows faded. The whispers stopped. But those who had known the story, really known it, understood something others didn't. Some miracles are born of sacrifice. Some love is so deep it echoes beyond death. And some choices, quiet, unspoken, can change the shape of a life forever. In the end, Khalil lived, not because the world was fair, but because someone made it fair. For him, for love, for peace.